Genshin Impact's huge open world and complex story are largely inspired by real-world elements and vastly different works ranging from philosophical writings to real countries to obscure occult spellbooks. Its creator MiHoYo often goes the extra mile to delve deep into the fabric from which they borrow from. Here's an example. Every region of Genshin Impact's world of Tevat is inspired by a real-world country. The soundtrack of these regions is always performed by orchestras native to these countries. After all, who else could perform music inspired by a region better than its native people who have experienced the culture their whole life? It's a great way to organically grow the world from simple building blocks, and as a result, oftentimes the stories write themselves. There's a ton of lore and backstory hidden in the smallest of places, such as item descriptions. Here's another example. Love her or hate her. All of us Genshin Impact players remember La Signora, but few know that she became all geeky and fiery to the tragedy of losing the love of her life, a story told only by item descriptions. This philosophy of draping absolutely everything with meaning extends even to the names of the rather mundane looking creatures. The many variations of Hypostases, or just cube boys if you prefer to keep it informal. The symbolism used in their names can even predict future storylines. Here's how. With the release of 3.2, there are now 7 hypostases in the game, each corresponding to one of the 7 elements. From lightning to Dendro, we now have all the elements covered, and they can be considered a complete set. The term hypostasis or hypostasis for plural refers to the underlying state or substance of reality. That alone should hint at them being much more important than just a few cubes to push around. Each hypostasis has a name attributed to them. Side note. Although I try to imitate the pronunciations, chances are I'll still butcher them badly, so feel free to correct me in the comments.
Shut it, Paimon.
The Electro hypostasis is called Aleph, and the new Dendro hypostasis is Zayin. These are not random assortments of letters to make them sound cool. These are actual letters from the Hebrew alphabet. Each hypostasis corresponds to a letter. The Electro hypostasis was among the first 3 to be released with the Genshin Impact 1.0, alongside Anemo Hypostasis and Geo Hypostasis. These 3 were named after the first 3 letters of the alphabet: Aleph, Bet, Gimel. Now this is where it gets even more interesting, as some schools of thought attribute symbolism to each letter. Before we start, let's also take a quick look at the Archons of Genshin Impact's world of Tevat. The Archons are the 7 gods who each oversee one of the 7 nations of Tevat. They were the final victors of the bloody Archon War taking place 2000 years before the main story. Each Archon is related to one of the 7 elements in the game, much like the hypostases. The word Archon itself comes from Greek and denotes a person who claims the right to rule. So we have our holy trinity of a region, its Archon and its hypostasis, each affecting one another in some way. Let's start by taking a look at the very first hypostasis, Aleph, who inhibits the element of Electro. In the Kabbalah school of thought, Aleph represents the creation of something from nothing. It is closely related to beginnings and the ultimate reality, while also being timeless, spaceless, and omnipresent. It also represents perfection beyond human comprehension. During the Inazuma chapter, we visit the land of Electro and Beelzebul, commonly referred to as Raiden Shogun. She is perfection in human form, going as far as creating a living puppet of herself to reign the land, instead of assigning anybody else to the seat. Meanwhile, she isolates herself into a plane of her own consciousness to meditate on greater goals. Fittingly, Aleph consists of 2 letter yods, separated by a diagonal line and representing the higher world and the lower world, or in this parallel the real world and whatever world she meditates in.
Perhaps only if time stands still will the lightning's glow never fade.
Her ultimate goal has been to her land in eternity, to preserve the current moment, as she fears the inevitable divine intervention from greater gods will destroy her nation. This will ultimately fulfill the symbolism of Aleph, as eternity can be described as timeless, spaceless, and omnipresent. By the way, the Hebrew word for God is El, written with Aleph and Lamed. Raiden's real name is A, and written out with Latin characters is almost identical. Bear in mind that the Electro Hypostasis was released with Genshin Impact 1.0. At this point only the first two regions, Mondstadt and Liyue, were released, and while development was certainly already started, the Inazuma region was still a whole year away. Nevertheless, the very first Hypostasis already prophesied many elements of the Electro Archon story. The second letter of the Hebrew alphabet is Bet, which is the name of our lovely Anemo Hypostasis. The literal meaning represents a house, which in turn represents a container or a vessel. The body is meant to contain the soul, allowing it to act in this world. Anemo Archon Barbatos, or Venti, has not always been in his current physical form. He once had a friend whose form he overtook after the friend's death, making him live in a container to roam the lands of Mondstadt. The third hypostasis is of Geo origins and is named Kimmel. Side note, do not attempt to kill it without melee characters, it's a bad idea. The first two letters can be perceived as two opposites. If we take a look at Mondstadt and then Inazuma, it is pretty clear that they are like night and day. Even the regions they are based on in real life are basically on the opposite ends of the globe. Now, Kimmel symbolically seeks to unite and harmonize these two opposites. Again, Liyue is based pretty much in the middle of these two countries, so the symbolism runs deep. But Kimmel also represents giving and receiving. Put these two actions together and you got the contract. Another fact of Kimmel is the reward and punishment, which again is just a result of either a successful or a failed contract. And there's nothing the people of Liyue allow more than contracts. It can also represent a rich man giving charity to the poor. The Geo Archon Morax, or Zhongli to the common man, literally created the What's Money Mora, and giving it to the people is the story's manifestation of its origins. Version 1.2 added the mountainous region of Dragonspine to the game, and a few short months later version 1.5 added a new Cryo hypostasis to the region. With it being the fourth hypostasis, we could already assume that it will be called Talet. With Talet being related to the element of Cryo, which is the element of the Archon and Tsaritsa of
I bet it's that Gunhilder girl talking about me behind my back again.
A few moments later.
The region is called Snezhnaya. The fact that we are talking about the Tsaritsa means that we are now in the future content prediction phase of the video. Most interestingly, the Cryo Archon story will be the last of the 7 regions. So at this point, it's still years away and everything here can be taken with at least a grain of salt. Or perhaps a whole lot of grains to make some vodka, firewater. It is important to note that the Tsaritsa leads the army of Vatui, who are among the most consistent enemies of the story. We see them in every corner of the world, from Mondstadt to Sumeru, even on the Dragonspine mountain. They seem to act for the fulfillment of the mysterious master plan Tsaritsa has. He was a victim in an apocalyptic event 500 years ago, when the great human-built godless nation of Khaenri'ah was destroyed by some celestial gods. Now she seeks to create a new world, free of these gods who give and take on a whim. Let's see what the Hypostasis can tell us. Talet is a word for a door or a gate, and indicates the selflessness and humility required to pass through. It represents the nullification of one's ego to get closer to divinity. We can recruit one of the Fatui harbingers, Tartaglia. He has some interesting things to say about the Tsaritsa.
Her Royal Highness, the Tsaritsa, is actually a gentle soul. Too gentle, in fact. And that's why she had to harden herself. Likewise, she declared war against the whole world only because she dreams of peace.
The act of reaching divinity culminates in the realization that we as humans have nothing on our own and depend on greater forces for everything. That seems exactly like the dilemma of the Tsaritsa, who has already had to deal with the unforgiving power of the gods. The left also symbolizes structure, a strong will, and perseverance. The Fatui are a highly hierarchical military structure that carries out the Tsaritsa's will. As for the rest of it, there's an interesting side quest that sheds some light on the activities of the Fatui. Katarina in the Chasm is one of the Fatui, but due to the unfortunate personal tragedies, she's actually kinda friendly to us. According to her, the Tsaritsa believes that at the end, everybody will face a common enemy, which probably means the divine gods, and thus preparations are done to combat it. Apparently the brutal means taken are justified as they believe that no sacrifice will be in vain. The current number one goal of Tsaritsa seems to be gathering up the gnosis of other archons. Gnosis are devices used to contact celestial gods. This is probably the opening of the gate we are prophesied, the gate to heavens to take down the gods. To rebel against the gods themselves certainly takes a strong will and more than a healthy amount of perseverance. So we can safely assume that the Tsaritsa will inherit these traits from the good old Hypostasis, Talat. July 21 of 2021 marked the release of Inazuma with version 2.0. Naturally, we also got the new Hypostasis with this version, Pyro Hypostasis. Following the schema thus far, we will think that it will be named after the fifth letter of the Hebrew alphabet, Hey, but this time Mihoyo threw us a curveball. You see, the next Hypostasis, the Hydro one, is called Hey after the fifth letter. It will be released a bit later, but it makes sense since the boss design team probably works in a somewhat different time frame than the overall release team. And it is entirely possible that the Hydro Hypostasis was created first and only released later. But the Pyro Hypostasis is not named after the sixth Hebrew letter Vav either. So where is it? This Ayin guy? If we move down the alphabet 10 more letters, we arrive at the 16th letter. There it is. Now, since we have already linked the symbolism of the letters to the overall story elements of Genshin Impact, we can assume that the vertical leap was taken with symbolism in mind. It's probably still true that the Hydro Hypostasis was created first as the fifth Hypostasis, and the Pyro was the sixth. And since the symbolism of the sixth letter does not fit the vision Mihoyo has for the game, why not move forward 10 pages to go to the 16th letter? The Pyro Nation of Natlan, led by the Archon Murata, is future content, and the following will be largely speculation. Out of all the regions, Natlan has the least amount of information available, to the point that some people are hypothesizing that the nation is actually a barren wasteland, although I can't see that being true. There's already Khaenri'ah, the destroyed godless city, that is also coming out in the future. Although even Khaenri'ah has at least one local NPC in the game to tell us about it. Natlan only has a handful of scattered people who have been there, and the only thing we are told about is the abundance of natural volcanic hot springs. Let's examine the symbolism behind the Hypostasis to see if we can unveil something interesting. The letter Ayin means eye and stands for vision and bringing forth hidden lights. It tries to look behind the veil and relates to time. This probably means that the Archon is someone with a very strong outlook on the future. It's also not far-fetched to think that we might get some time travel shenanigans during the Pyro Archon quest, especially as there are theories that the Pyro Archon is dead or in a similar state, and time travel might just fix that small problem. Furthermore, Ayin symbolizes taking one from darkness to light. the urges to break through our limitations to see what is not yet visible to us. This probably sums up quite a few elements of the upcoming Pyro Archon story, and what could better represent the eradiction of darkness than the pyro element of fire?
Repeat after me. 3, 2, 1. 1, 2, 3.
The Hydro Hypostasis was released shortly after the Pyro one in version 2.1, which further indicates the possibility of it being developed first. As such, it was given the 5th letter in the Hebrew alphabet, E or Hey. I'm really struggling with the pronunciation here as there are often multiple variants, but I'll refer to this one as Hey for now. The nation of Fontaine and its Pyro Archon fossil Earth is yet again unreleased content, but as this will be the next region in the game, we have a bit more to go on.
Is that where you're headed next? Fontaine, the nation of justice? As far as I know, that nation operates in the judicial system.
We know that Fontaine and the Archon idealize justice, to the point of the Archon presiding over every court trial she can. Hey means divine revelation, which could hint at religion playing a big part in the storyline. Also, the Hydro nation is likely based on 1910s France, which at that point just had the massive separation of the churches and the state, further cementing the notion that religion will have a big part in the story. Hey also represents the freedom of choice, which might be a part of the grand dilemma in the Hydro nation's main story, and certainly played a huge part in its real-life counterpart's history. Last but not least, Hey symbolizes the gift of life. Hydro or water is essentially the gift of life for both the flora and the fauna of the world. So it makes for an excellent parallel and might have some future story considerations in matters of life and death. Before we move on to our last hypostasis, there is a small side note about the so-called pure hypostasis. These three were released in 1.2 as a temporary event-only boss. Their naming scheme is different, referencing a real-life French spellbook Black Bullet, probably written in the 17th century. Amongst other things, the spellbook references Kabbalah, which is also the basis for the symbolism behind the Hebrew letters, so that's a cool throwback. The hypostasis names, Tiras, Etas, Besanar, are an intonation of a spell that should conjure both celestial and infernal powers. It's most likely a reference to Genshin Impact's celestial and abyss powers, but there doesn't seem much else of substance in there. Finally, with the recent 3.2 release, we have our 7th and presumably final hypostasis, the Dendro flavor. Following the conventional naming, but still skipping the 6th letter of Pyro, it is named after the 7th Hebrew letter, Zayin. Zayin is the symbol of spirit, sustenance, and struggle. The land of Dendro is Sumeru, and its Archon is Lesser Lord Kusanali, or Nahida for short. She is named the Lesser Lord because once there was a Greater Lord Rukkhadevata, although I suppose back then she was just Rukkhadevata since Nahida did not exist yet. Anyway, the Greater Lord passed away and the people got Nahida as a replacement. They're both supposed to be the god of wisdom, but since Nahida just eated into existence, she lacked the experience of her big sister. Thus, the people denied her as a god and she slowly started fading into obscurity. The inn also represents the struggle between opposites, the struggle of existence and the struggle for sustenance. This soul perfectly illustrates how Nahida had herself compared to her powerful and great predecessor, who seems to be the great opposite of her. Nahida's storyline is about overcoming the struggle of the predetermined perception of her, to finally move on from the previous lord and prove a standing for herself. Zayin also perfectly punctuates the 7 elements and the 7 hypostases by denoting the 7th day as the day to rest. If the work is done, it is time to move on. Everything is built on the shoulders of the giants. By making great use of existing works, MiHoYo has almost organically grown their own story of Genshin Impact. It would have been easy for them to use the Hebrew alphabet just to borrow some cool sounding names for their cube boys. While that approach would have been perfectly viable, diving further into the mysticism and tying it to other story elements elevates everything to a higher, much more fascinating level. The outcome of this design philosophy can be perceived in the ever-increasing popularity of Genshin Impact.